The Mind's Eye with Brian Turnov is available on Stitcher Radio, iTunes, and all major platforms. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the Mind's Eye. You are now standing at the intersection of history and mystery, science and the strange, and crime and the sublime. I'm DJ BJ Turnov, host of this audio-torium of audacity. On the last edition, you heard about the most famous Wild Wild West gunfight. It included Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday taking out those rebel cowboy outlaws. This week, we're going to stick with that same time period and examine the death of one of the most infamous outlaws of the time. Gang leader and robbery connoisseur Jesse James went on a decade-and-a-half crime spree, all while evading capture, well, up until his assassination, that is. His legend only growing more after his death. Seems pretty tidy, close the books on that one, but Jesse James faked his death so many times before that the authorities had to follow up on the one driving question: did he really die this time? Our guests, authors Daniel and Teresa Duke, they're going to give you a shocking answer to that question and an even more surprising reveal. Growing up in Texas as little kids, they were surrounded by stories that their great-great-grandfather really was Jesse James. For the last 2 decades plus, they've continued the research that Mama Duke started and may have finally put all the pieces to the puzzle of their family's past back together. And in doing so, they may have possibly rewritten a part of our frontier history. Dan and Teresa, they're going to present the results of their exhaustive research. We'll discuss the photographic evidence, their great-great-grandfather's diary, genealogical history, and a bunch more information that possibly proves Jesse James tricked all of us, faked his death, and lived well into his 90s. Decide for yourself when the Mind's Eye returns. We appreciate you staying tuned to the Mind's Eye. Our main question tonight: did notorious Wild West criminal Jesse James disappear and fake his own death? We'll scrutinize the evidence briefly, but no doubt that he had many reasons to. Thinking about disappearing probably isn't as uncommon as you think, but most people aren't going to go through with it. However, I just posted 5 stories about people who actually did. They figured out how to disappear and start a whole new life. Read about it now at our Facebook and Twitter pages at Mind's Eye Show, or just go to our website, themindseyemedia.com, where we have more information about next week's guest. That's right, I said it. I fibbed last week. We added an extra one before we hit the summer hiatus. I'll tell you a little bit more later after the interview. But first, check out the links to our guest tonight, Duke's siblings, who join us shortly. They're going to tell us about their book and great-great-grandparent, The Mysterious Life and Fake Death of Jesse James. Back in a Mind's Eye moment. We welcome Dan and Teresa Duke to the Mind's Eye. Their book, The Mysterious Life and Faked Death of Jesse James, provides evidence that the notorious outlaw, astonishingly, not only is their relative, but also that he lived decades after his supposed murder. Siblings Duke, appreciate you giving us a Mind's Eye moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us on the show. We really appreciate it.
Yes, we really do. Thank you.
Yeah, you guys definitely deserve, an open forum to talk about some of the information that you've gathered along the way. But I want to know who's going to run the show tonight. Who's the older one of the two?
Well, I'm the older, but Teresa's the she's the baby of the family, but she's also probably the meanest one. So
they go hand in hand. I'm the baby also, and I think that's what my family would say too. So
right, we kind of had to be though.
how many? How many Dukes are there, or do you have any other siblings?
One other sibling. He lives in Belton, Texas.
Oh, okay. So not too far?
Near Fort Hood. Yeah, not too far.
Okay, good. You're all still relatively close to each other. Is there a competitive spirit amongst you?
Oh, yes.
I can tell. It's bleeding through already, for sure. All right, so let's talk about the book. And obviously, a great debt is owed to your mom. Dan, Teresa, tell me about Mama Duke and her influence and impact on the book. Dan, you want to start with that one?
Okay, yeah. Mom was the one that spearheaded all of this. The investigation into Jesse James, whether our family story was true or the traditional story was true, and she's the one right off the bat. it was in the 90s when I was in college, and she really got into it. And she kept calling me while I was at work in Houston with all these discoveries she had made. And that drove me crazy because I was stuck in a cubicle in Houston trying. I couldn't wait to get home to see the important stuff, all the family research she had discovered. And she just went from there. She started out with photographs, family photographs we had, and she wanted to see if, like I'd mentioned, she wanted to see if our family story that she grew up hearing, that Jesse faked his death and he was her great grandfather, if that was true or if the traditional story was true. So she took what she had in the beginning, the family photos and a couple of other items, and went to the best experts she could find to see if they could verify whether the photos were the same people, or if our relative was our ancestor was a different person. So she went to the Austin Police. Well, first it was the Texas Department of Public Safety, which is our state police. She went to their forensic department at their headquarters in Austin, and they verified that our photos matched known James family photos. And then she went to two others. One was the Austin Police Department, who also verified our photos matched. And then they went to one in New Jersey, who at the time was called Visionics. And they were world leaders in facial recognition technology. And then they were later purchased by a different company. I think it was called Identics. But she was real happy with that. She was ecstatic. We all were. She thought the James Forman Museum in Missouri would be just as happy to know that Jesse didn't die as everybody thought. And that was the last thing they wanted to hear. So she just kept digging after that. She was disappointed about the reaction of the James Farm and Museum and some of the experts around connected with them, or some of their experts. And she just decided to keep digging, and that's what turned into a 20-plus year adventure.
And that's
And
what,
it also
please.
led us down a lot of different rabbit holes throughout. When she, when she always heard it and she wanted to, come out. She thought when she gathered all her evidence, she thought people would be so happy that Jesse James didn't die as history stated. But she didn't realize that this was going to just lead to so much more and so many rabbit holes. And it's been an amazing adventure.
And in the history books, James is described as an outlaw. To some people, he's a hero. To others, he's can be considered a racist radical or something. Others, outside of great grandfather, what are your thoughts about Jesse James and all the research that you've done and all the rabbit holes that you did go down that you mentioned?
People, when it comes to, he fought with Quantrill's guerrillas, and they were Confederate guerrillas. But at that period, in that part of the country, a lot of people don't realize the fighting had been going on for 10 years prior to the Civil War. Just atrocities on both sides, and it just slowly built. And it was more of a almost. It reminds me of a violent version of two rival football teams coming together. The one side does one, pulls a dirty trick or something. The other side wants to get them back the next year. And it just kept building until both sides literally hated each other. And in a lot of cases, politics didn't seem to play much of a role in it. It was just almost like a blood feud. And like as for racist, one of the men who rode with them was a black man, one of the guerrillas, and all the guerrillas were known and quoted as not all of them, but all the well-known guerrillas who were quoted, when asked about him, they thought of him as a man's man and just a fellow, like a brother guerrilla or compatriot. So they had no problem with that. I think it was more, like I had mentioned, or Teresa had mentioned to someone earlier, the younger brothers, for example, they sided with the Union until their father was murdered by Union guerrillas, and that's what forced them. They didn't really care about politics. They just wanted to get back at the guys who killed their father.
Yeah. So you think it was less pro-slavery view, more of those type of incidences. I know he had one when he was, I think, aged 14, where somebody killed his father, if that's the same incident that you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, that was the younger brothers was Cole Younger, Jim Younger, and Bob Younger, and some others. But yeah, Jesse's their father was killed.
Or stepdad, excuse me.
Yeah, exactly. And their stepdad was hung, but he wasn't killed. He just had permanent brain damage. Jesse's stepdad, and his mother was pregnant at the time. She was strapped to a tree, and some say whipped, some say she was just pushed around, but she was pregnant. They roughed her up, and they'd strapped Jesse, who was 14 years old at the time, to a plow and brutally beat him. So I can understand that need or feeling for a need of revenge. It was strange times, and I'm not trying to make any of them out to be saints. We just wanted to know what the family's story was and the truth about it. And then as you research that, you start finding, reading stories like that. And it was a bad time. I mean, atrocities happen to people on both sides. So
yeah, and I think it just depends on the perspective of the person. I mean, to some, he was famous, and to others he's infamous, and I think it just kind of goes with the territory. When you build up that kind of legend and myth, you're gonna have all kinds of opinions, good, some bad. So
well, I'm glad that you brought that up, actually, because he, part of that legend, sometimes he's labeled as America's Robin Hood. I mean, personally, and respectfully, I didn't really see any evidence that he gave any of the stolen money to people outside of his circle. I mean, and this is something that was mentioned in the book, and I really respect that you said that often banks that he did rob, some of them would fold afterwards, and the public, that had their money invested or was part of in the bank would only get cents back on the dollars, and, not to mention the trail of innocent dead people that he left. So, to me, America's Robin Hood label just doesn't really, for me, hold true. I mean, do you guys agree or disagree with that? Or maybe you found evidence otherwise?
There are stories of him and some of his gang members, but mostly attributed to Jesse, of him helping out poor widows who didn't have the taxes to save their family farm and things like that. There's no proof of those stories. So in a way, a lot of that, I think, has been PR built up over the years. And you know how legends and myths grow. I think he'd just come out of years of war. He was outlawed because the guerrillas weren't granted amnesty at the end of the Civil War like regular Confederate soldiers were. And he tried to surrender, and he was shot while he was riding into Lexington, Missouri by Union pickets. None of the guerrillas were granted amnesty, and they were hunted down and executed. So he didn't have a lot of choice. It was either leave or stay and live up to the outlaw name, and that he chose the latter. But and he was no angel by any means. But I think there was later in life, I believe he had a greater purpose, and he helped a lot of places. Well, he helped the communities in his area, but at the same time, that could be viewed as like a mafia character helping out the people in their neighborhood just so they have a buffer of support. So you never really know. It's hard to tell. I wish I could get into his head and see how he thought, and unfortunately, that's impossible. But
there was a gentleman by the name of John Newman Edwards, and he was one of the main reasons that we feel Jesse, he helped create his legend, basically. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there.
What do you mean by that?
Well, he would write during the, when Jesse and the gang, when they were doing their activities, he would write articles, glamorizing Jesse and the gang. And in his mind, he really thought they were like heroes, and I want to say he was kind of the one who built up the Robin Hood legend for Jesse.
He played a very large role in that. And after the Pinkerton Detective Agency threw a bomb into Jesse's mother's home, killed his little brother, blew the mother's arm off, and maimed the stepfather's hand, that put a lot of the public, I guess the public fell in behind the James gang and fell for a lot of the articles glamorizing the James gang and their deeds. Basically they painted it where he was the James gang was fighting the man, the evil railroad tycoons who were running over innocent people and that type of story. So they painted John Newman Edwards played a large role in that Robin Hood legend.
Just for those not familiar, we've talked a little bit about the legend. He's an outlaw. He robbed he robbed banks, and a lot of the other parts are up for subjectivity and your own opinion. But what's the popularized narrative of the end of his life? His assassination. What's written in the history books, and then we'll go into the difference, which you found.
Okay. So what was written in the history books was on April 3rd, 1882. Bob and Charlie Ford, who were his first cousins, shot Jesse. Supposedly he was standing on a chair and straightening a picture, and they took that opportunity to assassinate Jesse James. It was a plan that Governor Crittenden of Missouri at the time he reached out to them to assassinate Jesse James. But of course, we don't agree with that theory.
Yeah, and you guys brought forth a lot of evidence, and Jesse James in faking his death is almost like the boy cried wolf. I mean, how many times, Daniel, did Jesse James fake his death before this one?
Yeah, like in 1879, most people don't realize that Jesse had tried to fake his death in the Indian Territory with George Shepard. One of his fellow gang members was said to have shot Jesse in the back of the head while they were riding on horses, and he rode into a nearby town, told everybody he just killed Jesse. A posse was formed and went out to try and find the body. They couldn't find the body, so nobody believed it. And there were even reports in like the Galveston Daily News talking about how Jesse's mother's taking the word from Jesse's mother that Jesse was really dead was basically useless because she had claimed it so many times in the past.
So for this one, how did he pull it off? Teresa, Daniel, whoever wants to chime in on that one.
I think it was. I don't think he planned on this one. I think he took I think he and members of the gang, and I actually don't think Jesse knew of it right away. When he found out, he went along with it. But his first cousin, Woodhite, was said to have borne a strong resemblance to Jesse. And a lot of people, like most people in the country, most of the law enforcement, like the Pinkerton Agency and different detectives and sheriffs, didn't have a good description of Jesse's identity. Nobody could really verify, his identity except those close to him and his family members. So that made it easy it led to a lot of confusion with the lawmen, and it made it easy for Jesse to get by with that. But Woodhite was in a love triangle with Bob and Charlie Ford's sister, Martha Bolton. And there was another guy involved, Martha's farmhand. She was a widow. She had a farmhand named Jim Gibson. There was a fight at Martha's house. Woodhite and Jim Gibson both died. And it said that Woodhite was buried in a shallow grave, and that was that. Until the day of the alleged assassination on April 3rd, 1882, while Jesse's body was allegedly, or the alleged body of Jesse was being, the coroners were inspecting the body. It was so convenient, fitting the story. They claimed that Woodhite's body was found and brought in the same day. There's a lot of controversy on when Woodhite actually was killed. Some say in December of 1881. Others say it was right around the same time the alleged assassination of Jesse took place. He bore a strong resemblance to Jesse. Nobody had a good identity. Only one body was displayed, which was odd because even back in those days, if any town or anybody killed an outlaw, they were always put in a coffin and put on display for the whole city to see. I guess to serve as an example to would-be criminals. But anyway, the body of Woodhite was never seen, and nobody knows what happened. To this day, nobody can find a grave for Woodhite, which led us to believe that it was more than likely Woodhite who was the one killed and passed off as Jesse.
So Bob Ford didn't assassinate Jesse James. He helped fake his death then.
Exactly.
What would be his, I mean, I guess, what would be his motive for that?
Well, he would help Jesse, who they were said to have idolized. He would, and on top of that, they would get the reward for killing Jesse from the governor. So, and a lot of people don't realize also the Governor Crittenden was distantly related to the James family. Several of the sheriffs, like W.J. Courtney from Ray County, and even Sheriff Timberlake from Clay County, where Jesse lived, or where he grew up, they were both related to Jesse. And it was kind of funny when you read of them forming posses. It never, even in the history books, it never seemed like they were really trying hard to catch him. And then you find out they're related, and that all kind of added up real quick. Yes.
Right, to help him escape.
And so his body. Just to get this right, they put Wood Height, Jesse James' cousin, in place of him in the funeral, and that was essentially the body that they used. Wouldn't Jesse James be pissed off at Bob Ford for killing his cousin also? I guess, it sounds like they're all related, but wouldn't he been kind of pissed off about that?
It's said that Dick Liddell, one of the gang members, was the one who shot Jesse, or Wood Height. And Dick Liddell had turned himself in, and that's a real sketchy story too. There's not many details on what Dick did. He supposedly ran to the nearest authorities and told his story in exchange for protection. But when you put the whole story together on the day of the assassination, all the people involved in it, nothing adds up. It's full of holes, and no pun intended, but that and many other parts of the story are just full of holes. Dick Liddell was said to have shot Wood. Bob and Charlie Ford were there. Maybe, I would imagine, if Jesse had questioned it, and I'm sure he did, he would have wanted the story. And I would imagine if it was explained to him by somebody he trusted, he would have forgave him.
And
Definitely.
you believe that you also found some inconsistencies in Bob Ford's statement to the police also, right?
Oh yeah, they said they got mixed up on the gun they used. He would say one thing and then change his story. He did that several times, and during the coroner's inquest, it wasn't just Bob Ford making mistakes. It was the Z Mims, who was allegedly married to Jesse. We believe she was married to Wood Height. They were all, and Z Mims was also one of their cousins. Wood Height, Jesse, and Z Mim were all first cousins. People say, history says that Jesse married Z, but we believe it was Wood Height that was married to Z. But during the coroner's inquest, they asked her, like, for example, how old is Jesse? She had this is a man she was supposedly married to for several years and had 2 children with. She didn't know how old he was, and she didn't know whether or not he was missing a finger on either of his hands. But when they questioned her about any jewelry she had, she knew every piece of jewelry down to all the fine details, how many diamonds were in each brooch and things like that. And it was kind of odd. If she'd been married to this man for several years and had 2 children, you'd think she would at least know his age.
Was she also aware of what happened to Wood Height and Jesse James' fake death as well? Did you see anything with that?
I believe she was aware. Well, I'm sure because it hit the news. And I think she would have been aware before she was even in the house, before she was questioned. Maybe Bob and Charlie Ford told her. Instead of shooting the body in the house, they may have brought the body in and told her, "Look, this is a story." Wood Height was known to be a ladies' man, so you could tell. I would imagine she knew or suspected he was cheating. If that was the case, she probably wouldn't have been too happy with him. Maybe she wanted him dead. But there's a lot of stories that are just speculation. Yeah. But at the same time, you can play it out in your mind how that could easily be played off.
And I guess when even if she would bring something up to the authorities, to the police, when the Missouri authorities are related to Jesse James and they're tasked with finding him, it doesn't really seem like they're going to probably do anything with that information anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Now this next comment is, I hate to say this, but it's something that was found on, I read it on Wikipedia, and I just want to kind of see what your thoughts are on it, and if you've ever kind of tried to go down this rabbit hole. Charlie Ford, it supposedly says that Charlie Ford, who helped, plan the murder, assassination, he wrote letters that were unsent to James's mother, asking for her forgiveness. And Teresa, Dan, have you ever tried tracking down any of those supposed letters or anyone from the Ford family to verify that claim?
We have talked to, my mother did at one time, and we were part of that. We did actually try to track down some Fords to get their side of the story. And my mom encountered a man by the name of Willie Ford, who was related to Bob Ford. And they sent us a picture. We didn't add it to this book. It's in my mother's book, but it's a picture of Bob Ford and our grandfather riding together. He sent us some other evidence that really strong evidence pointing that Bob Ford was really his relative. But yeah, they, it's kind of weird, but in their family circle, they still considered Bob Ford the dirty little coward
But
that he went down in as history.
But Willie he had mentioned some of their family split too. Some of them believe the traditional story, and Willie Ford, I don't even know if he's alive today. I don't believe he is, but he they believed that Bob and Charlie helped Jesse.
Yeah, so it's kind of like ours. There's a lot of people who have split opinions on it, but she did definitely try to track down some of the Ford and relatives.
What does your brother think? I think you said he was older. Does he agree with you, or does he disagree with you, and other family members disagree with you as well?
He agrees with the side of the family who disagrees were some of the Courtney Branch and that's a long, convoluted story. It's strange. There's all kinds of they fought my mother on several attempts. She proved them wrong. And they one of them even defended the 1995 DNA exhumation, or the exhumation and subsequent DNA testing that was done in Kearney, Missouri in 95 by the James Forman Museum. But most of them are quiet. There's a few, like, for example, one of our biggest detractors on the family side was Max Courtney, but Max's brother Eldon fully supports Mom, in our story. So it's even that's two brothers that are completely against each other on the story. It gets real interesting, but they all knew it. And then there's all kinds of accusations on their side of the family. They think that we're after money that they had. I mean, there's all kinds of wild accusations.
But they did. But even with the difference in opinions, they all agreed there was a documented name change, as well as they all knew that Grandpa had a family secret that he, tried to conceal when he moved to Texas. So, I mean, they may not agree that it was Jesse James, but they did agree that, about the documented name change. Why did he have that name change? What was this family secret? So there was a lot of stuff that they even, like, mystery that they were trying to dig at to try to, uncover the truth as well.
And did they find anything substantive that says another story?
No, I think
they can't prove anything. They always, they'll try to, and then they'll scream, and that always, if you're online with groups like that always seems to turn sour real quick.
His granddaughter, he did have a granddaughter named May Courtney. She was his granddaughter. She's passed on now. But we had the opportunity to visit with her a couple of times. She had a lot of his belongings, and a lot of his stuff she burned.
Yeah, she burned over 200 letters and some of his journals, which really, to me, that's like a historic crime in my opinion. But
why? unless she hated him for some reason, you wouldn't do that to your family history, most likely. Anyway, so that's interesting. That's weird.
May was a small town teacher, and her husband was a small town Baptist preacher. She kept saying she knew that Jesse, or she would call him Grandpa. She knew Grandpa was in hell. That's all she would say.
Yeah. Well, I guess unless you thought it really was Jesse James and believed he was, you were on the side that he was a bad person, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's apparently, but at the same time, they were never above taking his money when he would buy them ranches, farms, things like that. He bought all of his children a ranch or a nice farm, and they had no problem taking his money, but then they would turn around and badmouth him behind his back. Half of his children did. The other half, loved him. So,
and she did admit that she would never. I think, and again, this is speculation, but she lived with him for a long time, and she would admit that he was involved in the border wars, the famous border wars, during the Civil War that Jesse James and them were all involved in. But she would never come out and actually say he was Jesse James. But I think it was hard on her because I think she felt like it was to her, her opinion, she felt like it was shameful. So she would always kind of hint at little things, but she would never come out and say. So I don't know. I personally think it was just it was hard on her to admit.
Divisive in life and divisive in death, even within his own family.
Yes.
And before we hit the commercial break, how did the coroner identify his body if there was no photograph of Jesse James available before that no one knew of before he was killed, and only his family members could identify him? So how did the coroner identify the body?
They basically depended on family and people who knew Jesse. There were very few people who knew him, and his family was going to protect him. Well, like for one example, his mother. They went and got his mother from Clay County, brought her up to St. Joseph to identify the body. She walked in the house and she said her first statement right off the bat was, "Gentlemen, you are mistaken. That is not my son." Somebody walked her outside. She came back in a few minutes crying and putting on a show, cursing everyone involved in the murder of her poor baby. So.
I'd say that'd be a pretty bad way to cover up your son's fake death if you're going to say it's a fake death, right?
Exactly.
Well, let's take a break. We're going to get into, now that we know how he faked his death, let's go into what happened after that, a little bit more of those stories, the DNA, the body exhumation, all of that. When we come back, The Mind's Eye returns in just a moment. We're back. It's The Mind's Eye. We left talking with Daniel and Teresa Duke, quite possibly the great-great-grandchildren of infamous outlaw Jesse James. We're talking about their book, The Mysterious Life and Faked Death of Jesse James. So let's go into a little bit more of the evidence, but let's talk first about who he became. You mentioned that he became James L. Courtney, and that there was two of them, two James L. Courtneys living at the same time. Wouldn't that be an easy way to get caught also? Dan, if you want to grab that one.
It could be, but at the same time, they're in different parts of the country. And Jesse came to Texas in 1871. There were other James Courtneys also, with the people with the same name in different areas. But that's a good question. It seems like it could be, but also back in those days, especially in Texas, I know for a fact, and even in parts of Texas to this day, you don't ask people questions about their background. Especially out in West Texas, it's still kind of the old way. Like I have a friend who's a Pecos County sheriff's deputy. He's a retired game warden, and now he's just a deputy to pass the time. He has stated before, you don't ask a man the age of his horse, and you don't ask him how much land he owns. And
that's an old school mentality for sure.
Yeah.
No doubt.
I liked it because it was almost like talking to somebody from the past, the 1800s. You just didn't ask people questions. So in those days with the social norms, it seems like that wouldn't have been a problem at all, just going by their social norms. the only time somebody was asked a question is if they were on trial, usually.
Yeah, and records are, loose at best. And I know I said that isn't that an easy way to get caught, and I've mentioned that a couple times. And I mean that because I do see the other side with it. You can go both ways, right? With one, I guess the James L. Courtney, the real one, I believe he was, or at least, he portrayed himself as an ex-Union soldier. I go back and forth. Well, Jesse James probably would have hated being, portraying himself as that, but also that'd be a great way of covering your own tracks.
Oh yeah, definitely.
How is he described by his family? Who's the type of man that he became? Jesse James, he was an outlaw. Who is James L. Courtney?
He was a Mason. When he, came to Texas, he became a Mason. He was a beekeeper. Had a big farm. He supported a lot of his family. He had a lot of money that he would hide in jars and bury in his, front yard and other places. He was a Christian man too, from what just my opinion, because there was a personal story once that he was affiliated with the Baptist church. And at that time, back in the day, music was kind of off limits with the Baptist church. And story has it that he would like to play. He had I don't remember the name of it. It's an old record player.
Like a Victrola or something like that. The old timey ones with horn.
And he would like to play it for his kids for entertainment. Well, somehow it got back to the Baptist church. So he was banned from getting to go into the church, but it didn't stop him. He would go every Sunday and stand outside and listen to the ceremony. So there's a lot of there's a lot of stories that he became a legend as James L. Courtney as well. People were afraid of him down here.
Why would they be afraid of him?
Just his demeanor. I think it was his demeanor. He was so tall and he was stern, and they said that he wouldn't, he didn't take anything from anybody.
He was fairly quiet. They said he had a dry sense of humor.
Yeah.
A lot of people, apparently a lot of people didn't get his sense of humor. So, but they said he was a big man. He liked his privacy, didn't like people asking questions. When we met a man named George Roaming, and he was a Freemason, a Shriner. And when he was 10, he knew, when he was a young boy, he knew our great-great-grandfather when he was old. So, and there's a lot of stories connected to that, but George would describe, he said, like, for example, two boys who lived a couple miles from him happened to find a little jar of gold at the base of a big tree on our great-great-grandfather's farm. And they took it home, and their dad told them to put, get dressed, get the gold. We're taking it back to him. They delivered the jar of gold back to our great-great-grandfather just because they were afraid of what he might do. And there's a lot of stories I wish I knew. Why would they be so afraid of what he might do? I know some of the families in his area knew who he was because their fathers or great-grandfathers were former Quantrell's guerrillas also. So maybe they already knew his reputation when they came down here, just through family lore, because maybe their dads or grandfathers were the same way. I don't know. There's a lot of interesting questions I still have on why they were afraid of him.
Before you mentioned you did a photo analysis with some experts. Just to clarify that, you have your picture of your great-great-grandfather, James L. Courtney. That's from your family collection. And then we have a known picture of Jesse James. I believe it was your mom who took in the 90s, took it to Visionics, and then Austin PD Media Lab. They were a forensics department that does photo analysis. What did they go? And you said that there was that they found that they are probably the same person. Go into that a little bit more.
Well, I was with my mom at the time, because when she started investigating, wanting to see if the pictures matched up, and when we went to the APD, and there were some other places we went to have it verified, but they told us that it was spot on. A lot of the the pictures were spot on. There was even a crease that at the time they had this, it was like you could zoom in and see all the little creases and scars on the face that you can't see just, staring at a picture with the naked eye. They had this machine that could zoom in on the features, and they noticed that there was this deep crease that matched in both pictures on the same side right above his jawline. It was in the historically accepted picture of Jesse James, and also the one of our picture, that was labeled James L. Courtney. So there was just a lot of exciting that the ears matched, the eyes. It was just an exciting moment. They were really, some were new right off when we were like, yeah, hey, this is Jesse James, we want to compare, and they were like, oh, okay, and then they were shocked. And then there were others who were like, they didn't know right up front, and they were like, yes, it's a 100% match. Who is this? And then when we would tell them, they were like, oh. So they had a lot of the, they didn't realize what they got themselves into at first. And she wasn't trying to trick them. She just, there was a lot of jaws dropping to the ground when they discovered the matches and when she told them the story. So
it wasn't just Jesse. They had also matched, well, like our family photo of he lived under the name of James Lafayette Courtney. We had his mother's photo. His mother matched Jesse's mother down to the same dress, same missing arm. They looked alike. They were wearing the exact same dress with the same pattern and had the same missing arm. And like the equipment they were using that Teresa had mentioned, it was so fine it could pull the fingerprints off of material.
I'm not going to lie. To me, it's some of it, the photo stuff, because I looked at those two pictures and I'm like, they don't really look alike to me. But, when you send it to the forensics PD, it's kind of hard to argue with that. And you want to know something? I actually spoke to Bill McCann, who was the Austin PD, who was the manager of the lab for Austin PD, who performed one of those photo analysis. And I just because when you get these type of claims, I just want a substantial, hey, they printed this. And of course, you wouldn't print it if it wasn't true. But I just like to double check when I can. And he said, no, he said it's true, 100%. And he really believes your story. And I wasn't trying to debunk you guys. It was more just to confirm, to say, wow, okay, if that's real, then, oh, wow, no, that's legit. So,
No,
and I think it would be even bolder, something that maybe you guys can maybe throw on your website, is maybe get a recording from him saying, no, this is 100% true to me. When you hear the voice match the information that you had, it just made it that much more powerful. Maybe just
that's a good idea.
That's a good idea. I never even thought about that.
And since we're going about that, why don't you just give out your social media links and just tell people where we get the book, and then we'll come back to some more evidence that you put in the book.
Yeah, I've got a Facebook page. I think it's Dan Duke Author on Facebook. You can just type in Dan Duke and author, and you'll find my links to the book. You can also go to the publisher's website and click on my name. It's the publisher's website, by the way, is innertraditions.com. Type in my name, Daniel J. Duke. It'll lead you to my author's page, and it's got every link attached to me. There's also I'm on Twitter, and I have a website. I've got two websites actually, but one of them is authordanduke.com. And then the website that I'd set up for my mother years ago is jessewjames.com.
I found this post that debates whether, James L. Courtney, Jesse James, they're not the same person. And the fact that you guys that you're using photo of Zerelda and James L. Courtney's mother and saying that they're matched. Someone said, posted that same picture, and they're claiming it's unaltered where it shows two arms. I'm sure this is something that maybe you've seen. Have you seen that by any chance? And, how do you respond to something like that?
Our mother had tried to get an permission to exhume our great-great-grandfather's grave and not dig it. She didn't want to dig the whole thing up. All we needed to do, according to forensic experts, to extract DNA is bore a small hole into the grave and retrieve a dime-sized piece of bone. Half our family, and of course the James farm and museum people connected with them, fought that tooth and nail. and that picture was brought up in court when we were trying to get permission, and it was proven. We had experts who were much more. Their experts that they used were, the guy was he painted with watercolors. That was his only qualifications. We had 3 separate groups of people verifying our photos, and she got another one and they showed that the arm they're claiming that she has was painted in by one of our relatives, who we believe was Herschel Shelton. He's now passed away. He was living in Arkansas. He painted the arm in. He was also an artist. And it was, when you zoomed in on it, you could tell the whole thing looked fuzzy, and it just, they added that arm. And that's the bet. And, of course, he denied it. So there's no proof as to who actually did it. We believe it was him, but we couldn't ever prove it. But the proof was that arm was added to that photo. They've made a lot of claims. And that was also the same group that had sent death threats to my mom and to us. The FBI got involved in it and put a stop to it. But that's a whole different story. They don't, it's so far, there's not many lows that I can think of that they wouldn't stoop to.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy right there, that the FBI had to get involved with something. They were sending death threats, and why would they do that?
Only they can answer that, but yeah.
I personally think it's because we were hitting too close to the truth, and I feel like, there's other claimants out there that have this kind, that have said their relative was Jesse James. So there's a couple of others, and they weren't ever harassed like this. They didn't get the death threats. They didn't get the cyberbullying. I think it was because our research hit too close to home, and I feel like maybe it was, I don't know. I in my opinion, it's greed. They had this set up, and they're getting they have a lot of money coming in. I don't know. I feel like it was just
who's benefiting the most from this truth not getting out there?
There's a lot of people involved with the James Forman Museum, and I know in the late 90s, the James Forman Museum was said to have been bringing in $6 to $7 million a year in tourist dollars. And that's not including all the little, every few years they auction something off for as much as they can get. But just the tourist money alone. And I guess and of course, I always say only they can answer that. So what we're saying as to why they would do it is only speculation. But we both think it's ego and greed.
Yeah, I mean, $6 to $7 million. That's a pretty penny. For such a small location, particularly in that area. I would imagine tourism probably has a lot of economic, beneficiary for the people.
Yeah.
There. So the easiest way to prove if James L. Courtney is Jesse James is to do that DNA testing against Zerelda, and you said that wasn't done because the picture, or it was stopped. But then you proved that the picture actually was altered, but for that reason, why wouldn't they let them continue with the exhumation to then test between back and forth? Because then easy solve, right there.
They were claiming it was a violation of the sanctity of the grave. Yet, what they left out, of course, in court, and Mom brought it up. It still didn't sway the judge. He said that both sides needed more proof on their side, and he just kind of left it at that. It's still hanging in the air. He basically said, if you have a little more proof in a few years, come back and try it again. And since then, we've gotten more than enough proof. We've found a different route to take. But what was I getting at? I'm sorry, I got off the track on that.
Is there anybody in the Jesse James? I don't know if there's any relatives left. Jesse James. I mean, what with their family? What do they say about? And if you've spoken to them about it, do they have any comments about it?
Mom had contacted a lady named Sue Laura Hale in California. She was a direct descent from the James family, and she gladly submitted some of her DNA. And that's another thing. Back in the 1995 exhumation, they acted like there was no living person that they could test, other than Robert Jackson. and we checked his genealogy. It was completely it's highly questionable. It's very questionable that he's even related to the James family. But there was a well-known one, Sue Laura Hale, living in California, and it's historically neither side debates her validity. She was a legitimate James family descendant, and she submitted her DNA. She went to her doctor. He took her blood and through strict chain of custody sent it to a DNA specialist here in Texas, and the DNA doctor here in Texas tested mom's against Sue Laura Hale's and he said it shows a definite relationship. Their DNA has a definite relationship. But he said if you want to prove that in court, you need to, excuse me, you need to go every step, like, from each generation up, from mom to her dad, from him to his mother, from her to Jesse, and then test Jesse's against Sue Laura Hale's. So we have Sue Laura Hale's, and that's the key. We just need to take each step up, and that takes time. And especially when you've got other family members arguing, it's a violation of the sanctity of the grave, yet they didn't have a problem exhuming Jesse's father-in-law, who was a Texas Ranger, Thomas Hudson Barron, in 1976. They exhumed him from Tom Cox Cemetery in Falls County, Texas, up to the cemetery that's next door to the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and Museum in Waco. They had no problem doing that, but when it came to this story, they fought it tooth and nail. And when they fight so hard and others are sending death threats, it just really makes you wonder what has them so afraid. If they're so secure in their belief and that their story is right, why would they bother fighting, spend all that money, time, and effort and potential jail time from the death threats? Why would they risk all of that if they're so secure in their beliefs? And, people these days, what a lot of people don't realize, in 1995, when the James Farm did the exhumation of the alleged grave of Jesse, they made a big show out of it. They dug the entire grave up, which was uncalled. They didn't need to do that. But in doing so, they kind of shot themselves in the foot, no pun intended, but there were two bodies in the same grave. One was a male who was buried face down, and the other was there were parts of a female skeleton in the grave also. So it was like, multiple bodies in one grave. Nobody was sure if it was his grave or not, yet they claimed it was, and they claimed that they proved their story when they'd never got any DNA from that grave. The DNA they got was a court order for Stephen Caruso, who was the Clay County commissioner, to turn in a sample of bone and hair. And he told Mom and I to our face when we interviewed him that the hair and tooth that he turned in it wasn't the hair and tooth they thought. He pulled the hair out of his friend's head, John Hartman, who was the Clay County Parks director.
Ridiculous.
Submitted John Hartman's hair, and he didn't go into detail about the tooth, but he said it basically had the same mysterious origins. And he said, I can guarantee you anything they tested had nothing to do with Jesse. And then they came out publicly and claimed their story was right. And the guy they hired to head the exhumation was James Starrs. He had no qualifications as a forensic anthropologist or scientist. He was a law professor.
Yeah, they didn't follow any chain of custody guidelines whatsoever.
Yeah, and the whole thing, and Stephen Caruso, who at the time was the Clay County commissioner, was quoted as saying it was a tawdry sideshow.
And I think that's where we like to really focus on the DNA. They're always saying we need to prove it, but they didn't prove anything with the 1995 DNA exhumation. If anything, they proved that there's a cover up there, just
yeah,
and it was a lot of shady stuff going on, and they didn't prove anything, and so we like to tell people, hey, we get it, if you don't, it's hard to believe an alternate story when this has been accepted history for so many years, but we just like to say, hey, we're not trying to force you to believe our theory, but at least focus on that 1995, the findings. And, at least look at that and open your mind to that, and why were there so many cover-ups with it? There's something there that they're hiding, and
And
of
now you
course we
have
think
on
it's
record one of the people involved saying that it was just a sideshow essentially. That's
right.
on. You guys got that
Exactly.
on record now.
Exactly.
And so I don't want to go into all the evidence that you put in because obviously you want to sell a couple books, get some of that gold treasure back, right? I would imagine. So you provide a lot of photo evidence. You mentioned what we just talked about, the photo analysis before. That you talked about one from an eBay photo, and then I believe there was another one mentioned as well. Of the photographic evidence that you provided, do you think the photo comparison is the strongest, or something else that you put in the book was stronger?
For me, sorry, Danny, I didn't mean to.
No, well, we'll go over both. Teresa, we'll start with you.
Okay, thanks. I think the strongest evidence is there's so much that's it's almost overwhelming. But personally, I think for me the strongest evidence is his journal where he has the signature J. James. That why would he have that in his journal? I don't know. There's just that kind of stood out for me. And in the same journal, he kind of mentions it was a little poem. It was like if James L. Gosh, I don't remember exactly. James L. Courtney. Oh, in Stillman Trice, James L. Courtney is and it has like an H, and it looks like the last word was kind of smudged out, but the only thing we could think of that would rhyme with Trice is heist. But I don't know, there's little things like that, and to me that was that's the J. James, I think.
Dan, what about you? Do you agree that the diary is the strongest, or one of the photos that you discussed in the book and showed is the strongest evidence for you?
If trying to put myself in someone like if I were just a guy who came in off the street and I didn't know anything about it, I would think the photos would be the strongest evidence. But after you start researching, I think the diary. I agree with Teresa on the diary. He mentions he not only signs his name J. James, he also initials it J.W. James on another page. There's known gang members, James gang members, throughout his diary, and even mentions a trip to Louisiana where it was a long trip. They went down steamboat and then got off the steamboat and rode north. He stayed at a man's house named Gervais Fontenot, who was a retired U.S. Marshal. And people would think, a retired U.S. Marshal, why would an outlaw stay there? Well, the same retired U.S. Marshal was also Jean Lafitte's nephew. And that blew my mind when I found that. The guy was the nephew of a famous pirate, Jean Lafitte. And it just showed more connections. There's a lot of little things throughout all our research that show deeper connections to more of almost like in some places, a criminal network.
And you called out, you said before, but he also called out his own personal, Jesse James gang members, right? By name.
Yeah. He would mention there were known James gang members throughout his diary. And, that's a big giveaway right there. And then also, not only that, but even the Courtney relatives, like Teresa had mentioned earlier, who fought our story, they admit to all the name changes in the Courtney name alone. They
family secret.
And like you had mentioned, running, it would earlier you had said something about him sharing the same name with his cousin seems like an easy way to get caught. And I forgot to mention that cousin, the original James L. Courtney, changed his name to James L. Haun, Haun. So they actually weren't carrying the same name. The original James Courtney took the Haun name, and Jesse took the Courtney name.
With the diary, you mentioned that JJ is initialized in it, some possible alluding to it, but gang members, from the Jesse James gang member mentioned in it by name, towns that they went to supposedly nearby of robberies that are mentioned in the diary. But then there were also towns and dates that didn't match the robberies. I mean, how do you explain that away?
My best theory on that, I used to wonder if it was a lot of copycat crimes. But at the same time, if you research the way they did it, it was always the same MO. And I would doubt an amateur copycat criminal would have the same MO they had. I mean, they picked up their methods while fighting as guerrillas during the Civil War. And later on, we found that, well, like Wood Height was his first cousin. Wood Height was also a part of the gang. And just like the guerrillas did in the war, they didn't always hit the same target as one big force. They would split up and hit multiple targets, which also helped, and they would hit multiple targets in areas that were more than a day's ride apart back then, sometimes even further. But that helped lead to confusion for the people chasing them, and it also helped confuse any physical descriptions of Jesse.
Was Bob Ford mentioned at all in this diary?
No, I don't know. He wasn't. Do you remember anything, Teresa?
I can't think of his
name. He wasn't mentioned in the diary.
I guess that'd be too obvious if you mentioned the guy who supposedly assassinated you.
Well, and also, the diaries we have range from 1870, from 1871 to 1876. There are more family diaries, and we know a couple of people who have them, but they won't show anybody yet. So we're just, hoping that one day we'll get to see those diaries as well, because there's no telling what. I mean, we've gotten all of this from just a couple of diaries, and there's so many more out there that could really blow it wide open. And, I would love to. They're full of history. I just wish we could get a chance to see them or get a copy of them.
Yeah, imagine. And some of those former gang members and friends of his, later on in life, they testified or would say, I think, even in newspapers, that he was alive, that he did fake his death.
Yeah, a lot of people had claimed, and even during the alleged assassination and that whole week and month following that, there were former gang members coming out claiming that no, they knew for a fact he was alive and that wasn't him and killed in St. Joseph. But people, I think the cover. First of all, you had the railroads. The robberies were so bad on the trains, railroads were rerouting and going around Missouri. It was hurting the entire state economy. The Governor Crittenden, wanted an end to it. All these different people wanted an end to it, and Jesse himself wanted to live a peaceful life, which is evidenced by his death attempt, his faked death attempt in 1879 and other times. So I think it was kind of everybody benefited as long as they believed he was dead.
So before you mentioned money and gold was found, he buried it. What about now? Is any of that money left? I mean, are the Dukes and the Courtneys, well off? Any of that gold still can be found or is still in the family? If you're willing to say.
We're not well off.
Well, you're talking to me, so obviously you can't be that well off. But maybe you could, and that's more of something on myself, But is there anything or any stories? I know you mentioned that there was a treasure map, possibly passed down through the family. But is any of that gold still kind of around?
Well, there are a lot of stories involving that. Well, like May Courtney, who Teresa had mentioned earlier, was his granddaughter. Small town teacher in small town East Texas. Her husband was a small town preacher. Somehow they owned oil royalties and had enough money to pay for a nice piece of property and a nice home. And they purchased homes for their children as well. And it just seems interesting wondering how they came about that. They just claimed they were frugal. But at the same time, the treasure map that passed down through the family, I had tried to figure out where that gold was, and that's when I wrote my first book on all the researching the treasure tales and what it led to. It ended up tying into treasures and treasure legends that tie in with the Freemasons, different outlaw characters across the West, and all the way back to the Templar treasures, and from the Knights Templar, and their treasures allegedly originated in the Temple of Solomon. So it was just really trying to discover one simple map led to a giant spider web of very interesting stories.
And sticking with just the diary, because I know I only have you for a few more minutes, but I want to circle back to what we talked about before with the diary and the treasure map that we mentioned before. Did you find that there was any connection between these two? Meaning that maybe some of the code that you believe that there was some code in the diary, was that any relationship to the treasure map that's been passed down through the family?
Some of it, yes. It was the same codes on the treasure map that he used in the diary. And then, on researching that, we had talked to a former Texas Attorney General Wagner Carr. He was real interested in Jesse and the treasures, and he had contacted Mom. They spoke for years. He even wanted her to write his biography, but she didn't have time because she was writing her books. He sent his driver out and showed Mom and I several treasures that had been recovered. He showed us the locations, and they told us a lot of stories about that. But the interesting thing, also, I'd mentioned Jean Lafitte earlier, and Jean's nephew, who Jesse knew. There were other criminals throughout the years, even I think it was the 1920s or 30s. Machine Gun Kelly, according to Wagner Carr, had involvement in some of these treasure catches when he would ride through Texas. And they said there were other figures, but they didn't go into naming everybody else. They just mentioned Machine Gun Kelly as having, no, actually, I'm sorry, it wasn't Machine Gun Kelly. It was Pretty Boy Floyd.
Okay, I thought we were going to have to clarify, and it's not the rapper that's right now, just for everybody, in case people might have been wondering. Although I don't think that's really our audience, quite frankly. They're just like, what are you talking about? But yeah, treasure hunting as a family just sounds like a great activity. Is that something that you do all together, or is that something that you do by yourself, Dan or Teresa, because you don't want to share the gold with each other?
We split that up sometimes. We go on trips together. It just depends.
But have you found anything for real? Any actual pieces of gold coins, if you'd admit to it?
Yeah, we've found the locations of where treasures were, and they've been recovered. The ones that we've been to. There's one or two that I would love to get to, but I can't get permission to get on the property.
You're obviously open to the idea that you actually could be wrong. I mean, do you think that there's a chance? I mean, what percentage do you think? How confident are you, percentages wise? Would you say?
100%. With all we have the DNA that matches to the James family. We have. There's just so much. We have the picture of the mother with the missing arm and the same dress. Pictures that match Jesse. The signature J. James. I mean, there's just so much that I think I'm 100% convinced he's Jesse.
Daniel, lasting thoughts and percentages. What do you think? 100% also?
100% with me as well. We've got more evidence than the traditional story has. We've got more photos. We've got his signatures, and just him naming gang members' names. All the photos match, not just of Jesse, but his family members and even relatives and friends around him. So we've got much more evidence, and I could run on about that. I want to ramble again, but 100% definitely.
Well, we got to give him a reason to get the book, and the proof is in the pudding. So you got to check him out. The photo. We can talk about all this stuff, but you got to see it and read about it for yourself. It's featured in Daniel and Teresa Duke's book, The Mysterious Life and Fake Death of Jesse James. Dan, Teresa, I really appreciate your time tonight here at the Mind's Eye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, anytime. It was a pleasure.
Mind's Eye wrap up when we return. Time for the Mind's Eye wrap up, and I know some of the information that you heard from Dan and Teresa Duke, probably pretty tough to swallow about the mysterious life and fake death of Jesse James. Often the truth is pretty hard to swallow. That's something that I've learned on this show for sure. Also, that I've learned that the truth is stranger than fiction. And keep that in mind for next week's show. That's right, I said it, next week's show. I unintentionally fibbed last week when I said this was going to be the last one. Well, I love you so much that I really can't even stop myself. Joining us for this weird-ass threesome is true crime author J.T. Hunter. He returns to tell the tale of the Lonely Heart Killers. He'll introduce you to Martha Beck, a young nurse dedicated to healing others, until her own hurting heart not only led her to sicko Raymond Fernandez, but also all the way to the electric chair. It's the basis for JT's new book, Tortured by Love, just like the way I'm tortured by your love, just without any of the deadly consequences. Join us next week for one final Love and Spoonful before we hit the short summer break. Until then, be well and let well be. DJ BJ Turnoff signing off for the Mind's Eye. The Mind's Eye with Brian Turnov is available on Stitcher Radio, iTunes, and all major platforms. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing.